Sometimes I like to look through old art and design books on archive.org. I found a lot of great stuff, but one picture I haven't been able to stop thinking about is this illustration of 6 different apron designs from the 1916 book Costume Design and Home Planning by Estelle Peel Izor. They all have color blocking with 2 different shades of fabric and a bit of embroidery on the darker areas. I think they're all pretty cute, but my favorite is definitely number 3. I've been wanting to make my own version for a while, but I wanted it to have some coverage on the chest. And another thing I'd been wanting to try for a while is one of those 18th to early 19th century workman's aprons that come up in a triangle and have a buttonhole, so you can fasten them to your waistcoat or jacket. This was a perfect option for the shape of number 3, so I did some sketching. Some of the sketches were bad and overcomplicated and quite different from the inspiration, but in the end I settled on a simple one. The top is extended up to form the triangular bib, and there's one piece of darker fabric added, with an inward curve to echo the ones on the sides. To make the pattern, I first cut a large square off the bolt of thrifted poly cotton I use for mock-ups, plus a couple of strips for the ties. I considered doing the pattern on the bias since all the edges are angled, but decided that the pockets and buttonholes would be a lot sturdier on the straight grain. I pinned the center of one edge to the top of my waistcoat and wrapped it around to my back. I had my sketch on a sticky note for reference. The workman's aprons seem to have come in a variety of heights, and I made mine go to the top button for maximum coverage. I drew out roughly where I wanted the bib and waistline to be with a light-colored marker, and marked the hem length and center front. Then I took it over to the table and sketched out the skirt portion, and cut around it, leaving a little bit of extra fabric. I cut a slit where the buttonhole will be so I could try it on properly. After buttoning it to my waistcoat, I pinned on the waist ties. These are the 2 strips I tore off the bolt, sewn together into one long strip so I can tie it around. The gap in between my lower ribs and pelvis is not much wider than the waist tie, so I had to make sure it was at just the right height. I marked the ends of the ties at the length I wanted. I decided to make the front panel a bit narrower, and drew the color blocking line on the bib. I then marked the location of the pocket openings. I took it back to the table and drew on the lines more definitively with a darker color. I'm folding it in half and making dots so the ink seeps through and I can draw it on symmetrically. I cut it to the actual size I wanted, finished drawing my lines, and sewed on the ties. I also stay-stitched around the edge of the bib, so the sides wouldn't stretch when I tried it on again. I decided to trim a bit more off the sides of the skirt. I also tried it on with an earlier cut of waistcoat to make sure the height of the top button was still the same, and it was. The sides of the bib were gaping quite a bit, but fortunately the color blocking on top made it possible to pinch out a little bit of extra and add some shaping to that seam. I marked it and cut it apart so I could trace it onto paper. I'm using this thin light brown paper I got from an estate sale, but it's a bit too narrow and I had to tape 2 pieces together. I'm folding both the paper and the mock-up along the center front so I can get it symmetrical. I traced the edges and then smoothed out the lines afterwards, though the pencil isn't showing up well on camera. Adding shaping to the bib seam meant the sides needed to be redrawn a bit, so I extended those lines and cut along them, and carefully rolled the edges along so I could widen the top to match. With folded pattern pieces like this, I don't like to cut both layers at the same time, because the paper always shifts and it turns out wonky. So I'm cutting out just the half I've drawn on, tracing it onto the other side, and then cutting out the second half. I did the same to the bottom part of the apron. Around this time I remembered that I have an old iron I bought specifically for ironing paper to stop it from curling so much. The reason for the separate iron is so I can keep it completely dry, because the water in my main iron would risk deforming the paper, even if I didn't turn the steam on. The apron is going to be fully lined, so I'm tracing a copy of the bottom piece. Now the piece I've already made can be the bottom lining, and I can cut my mock-up along the lines to draw out the seam for the color blocking. I'm doing the ties in a bit of an odd way. The end of the front part of the tie is going to be the top part of the side panel. I drew a long rectangle the width I wanted and traced that little angled piece for the front end, and a more angled tip for the other end. For the pockets, I just traced my side panel pattern, marked on the opening as indicated on the mock-up, and sketched out a large teardrop shape. I notched all the necessary markings, including the ends of my buttonhole, and punched holes for hanging it up. I labeled all the pieces and marked all the grain lines. Here's the finished pattern. We've got the outside pieces with the center panel, the side panel, and the extra bit at the top of the bib. Here's the pocket that'll fit nicely into that side front seam, and the bib top needs to be a separate piece on the lining too, because of the shaping along that seam. The front and back tie pieces are different, but I'm using one pattern piece for both of them. The full piece fits nicely into the color blocking in front, but when you fold the end back like so, it fits onto the side of the lining. I've written this on the pattern piece so I won't get it mixed up, but you could also make two separate pattern pieces. The book says the aprons are embroidered, but I know for a fact that if I put that much hand embroidery onto an apron, I will never actually use it as an apron. I'm bad enough at wearing my nice everyday clothes, and aprons are meant to get dirty. Fortunately, another thing I'd come across in the archive was some books about stenciling. It seems to have been fairly popular around that time, mainly for home decor items, but there is also mention of clothing. I don't think I'd ever done stenciling on fabric, and I know I'd never used it in a sewing project, so I wanted to try it. There are examples of stenciled things with some embroidery around the edges, and I considered doing that, but I still think it would be enough to make me not want to use it. So just plain stenciling was a good option all around. The original illustration doesn't have a lot of detail, but I like the way the whole embroidery shape fills in the corner. At first I was drawing a lot of squiggles and blobs, inspired by some wonderful Art Nouveau embroidered dresses, but when I started thinking about how the design would work as a stencil, I realized it would not. I tried changing the designs and breaking them up into smaller shapes, but it just wasn't going in the direction I wanted. So I started over, going in a more arts and crafts direction, and taking inspiration from various embroidered bags and cushions. The new design came together very quickly. I went back to the shape outlined in the original sketch and broke it up into berries and leaves, and added some flowers to the middle. Before starting on the stencils, I sewed up a test version to make extra sure I was happy with the pattern, which I was. I used a white cotton tablecloth and a turquoise bedsheet, and it came out looking very 1950s diner. I traced my pattern pieces for the side panel and bib onto the back of some wrapping paper so I could draw out the design at full size. I gave it a 1 cm border of empty space around the edges. I sketched out the overall shapes and divided them up into lots of segments. For the flowers, I used tracing paper to make a symmetrical drawing, and then went over those lines with more pencil so I could transfer a faint graphite outline to the paper and get all the flowers the same. I made the mistake of drawing the middle one first, and then when I did the two on the sides I found that the middle one was too short and I had to redo it. The flowers are growing from little squares, and the three on the sides have rectangles in between them. I had to reduce the bib flowers to just one, because I'd drawn that piece a bit too large in the sketchbook. For the leaves and berries on the bib, I kept the layout mostly but not entirely symmetrical, because I don't like completely perfect symmetry on organic designs. I went over all the outlines in black pen. I don't remember getting these clear plastic sale signs, but I assume they must have come from work. I wiped them down just in case there was dirt on them. There were just enough of them to do all the stencils. For the larger side pieces I had to tape two signs together, using packing tape on both sides. The bib was small enough to fit nicely onto half a sheet, so I cut the last one in half. I'm taping the plastic to my drawing so it doesn't move. It's a two-color design, so I traced out all the leaves on one piece in red permanent marker, and the berries and flower petals on another. Here you see me accidentally tracing some berries, but I went back and removed them later. I also traced the outlines of the pattern pieces themselves, so I'd have it for reference. I traced the side pieces in the same way, and used a ruler for the straight edges. After everything was traced, I began cutting the shapes out with an X-Acto knife. I started off with a pretty dull one, and things sped up a lot once I changed to a new sharp blade. The marker wore off the tape very easily, so I had to redraw those bits before cutting them. I made sure to scratch along the outlines of the pattern pieces, in case repeated washings took the marker off, which did end up happening, so I'm glad I did that. I cleaned off the remaining marker from the holes with rubbing alcohol, which is not necessary, but I didn't like how messy they looked. At some point in this process, I made a little leaf stencil for practice, and tried it out on some fabric scraps. I wasn't sure what the best tool would be, so I tested a variety of them. I got this very cheaply made yet overpriced pack of disappointing stencil brushes because that was the only thing Michaels had, and I regret buying them. I also tried a dense, round brush I'd bought at a different store last year. As usual, I don't have any actual fabric paint and I'm using screen printing ink left over from college, but at least stenciling is more similar to screen printing than painting is, so the wildly varying textures weren't too much trouble. After doing the small leaf samples, I did a couple more with the actual stencil, and then stenciled the test apron. I've tried out all the potential tools, and this brush was too stiff and wouldn't get into the corners well. This one was okay but not great. This one was alright for little details. This one was fine, but being on a stick did not do it any favors. This worked a lot better and put it on much more evenly. And this brush is pretty good as long as I don't overload it. So the winners are regular sponge and large round brush. I did the dark navy with the large round brush and the silver with the sponge, and the sponge made it come out very nice and smooth. The brush was a bit more uneven and it got a little bit squished under the edge of the stencil in some places, but it's not too bad. And I do want to do some shading, so the brush will be good for that, as long as I move it in small circles. Stenciling the already sewn up apron was not ideal, and I had to cut and overcast the buttonhole before stenciling, and then do the buttonhole stitches afterwards. I thought the flower petals looked a bit too small and far apart, so I cut those holes a tiny bit wider. I also marked the bib stencils so I would know which side is up, since the design is slightly asymmetrical and the berries only fit one way. For the main apron in this video, I had originally planned to use 2 different shades of brown cotton, the darker one for the sides and top, and the bright rusty brown for the middle and lining. The aprons in the book are made from heavy fabrics, but I came across a blog post that said heavy fabric isn't good for button-on aprons because it pulls down on the waistcoat. So these are a relatively lightweight plain weave cotton. It's a little bit lighter than the average quilting cotton, and it's washed and ironed. I traced out 2 side panels and the bib using fabric pencil. And hand basted along the lines with old cotton thread. I want the traced lines to be on the wrong side for sewing, but I need the edges of the pieces to be visible on the right side so I can line up the stencils. I lined up the leaf stencil with the basted outlines on the right side and held it down with a lot of glass pattern weights. I'm using gold ink for the leaves. It was very lumpy, so I added a tiny bit of water and mixed it thoroughly. I'm putting a smallish amount on the sponge and whacking it straight up and down. It took a pretty long time to build up a nice, even, opaque layer. I wanted a little bit of shading on the leaves, so I used a very small amount of brown and lightly dry brushed it around the areas where the larger berry clusters will be. I also added some brown to the squares underneath the flowers. To clean off the stencils, I laid them on an old towel and wiped them off with a rag. Once the stencil was clean and dry, I could flip it over and do the other side. I thought the tiny sponge was a bit tedious, so I cut a bigger one out of upholstery foam, but it didn't speed things up very much. I added the shading to the second side, and then did the bib in the same way. I also stenciled a second version of the bib, just for testing, because I hadn't settled on a color for the berries yet. I tried mixing a little bit of light blue with the last of my very lumpy dark blue ink, and a version with some purple added, but it all dried way too dark and didn't look good on the fabric at all. I tried again with a much lighter blue, and that showed up well and looked good with the other colors, so I went ahead with that one. This was a few hours after doing the gold, because it needs to be dry enough to not stick to the other stencil before you do the second layer. I wiped the stencil clean and did the other side, just as before. I scrubbed as much of the ink as I could off the vinyl tablecloth, because I don't want to risk it staining anything else. As mentioned, I had originally planned to use a rust-colored fabric for the middle of the apron, but I didn't like how it looked with this shade of blue. So instead I found an ivory-colored cotton in my stash that was the same weight, and which I had enough of to use for the center panel and lining. Before heat setting this ink, you're supposed to let it dry for at least 24 hours, so I left it for a couple of days and worked on other things. I pressed the ink on my hottest iron setting using a silk organza press cloth, so the iron wouldn't directly touch it. I also pressed it from the back. I've been told it needs 2 minutes total on each area of the design. I traced out the remaining brown pieces on the wrong side of my fabric. 4 pocket pieces and 2 waist ties. These are the front side of the waist ties, so I'm tracing the entire piece and marking the notches. I cut everything out with a little over 1 centimeter of seam allowance. For the ivory colored fabric there are fewer pieces, and I'm using a regular graphite pencil. I traced out the lining, the top of the bib lining, the center front panel, and the back portion of the ties. These ones attach to a different edge from the front ones, so I'm folding back the end and tracing the shorter version. I pulled out all the basting on the stenciled pieces, since the traced lines are still visible. I pinned and sewed the top of the bib on, for both the outside and the lining, matching up the pencil lines. I clipped the seam allowance on the inward curved edge and cut notches out of the outward curved edge, so it would press open smoothly over my tailor's ham. I pinned the ends of the brown tie pieces to the tops of the brown side panels. I'm sewing over the seam allowance that faces the center front, but I'm stopping at the traced line on the outward edge. I don't want any stitching in the seam allowance on that inner corner. I should have used brown thread for these seams. Oops. When I pressed open that seam, I clipped straight into the seam allowance of the tie, right where it meets the corner of the side panel, so the rest of the tie seam allowance would lie flat. I sewed the other tie pieces to the sides of the lining, also stopping at the inner corner. This time I had to clip into the lining seam allowance to make it lie flat, because it's attached on a different angle. Then it was time to add the pocket bag pieces, one on each side panel and one on each side of the center panel, matching up the marks for the openings. I sewed them on, not along the traced lines, but about 3 mm further into the seam allowance. For the brown panels, I did remember to switch to brown thread this time. I pressed the seams open to make sure they were flat, and then pressed all the seam allowance towards the pocket side. To help keep the pocket openings nice and smooth, I'm adding understitching to the pieces attached to the side panels. It's not necessary on the center panel ones, and would get in the way of pressing that seam open later. Then I can line up and pin the two side front seams. It's an opposing curve, but quite a gentle one, so it's not that hard to line up. The pockets get pinned together too. I used my adjustable zipper foot for this seam, just in case the bulk of all those pocket edges got in the way of my regular foot. I'm sewing to the pocket opening marks and stopping, then skipping over the opening and sewing the rest. At the very top of the apron I sewed right from the edge of the seam allowance, but at the bottom where there's an inner corner I'm stopping at the end of the marked line and leaving the seam allowance free, just like I did for the inner corners where the ties attach. The pocket bags get sewn separately, stopping right at the seam that connects them to the apron. I don't want to sew over the seam allowances on the center front panel. Doing this means I can press the whole seam open and none of the ivory seam allowance is caught in the pocket stitching. All the pocket material is pressed towards the side panel. I clipped the corners off the tie seam allowances and clipped into the center panel seam allowance right at the end of that seam, so it would lie flat like the inner corners under the ties. The difference in where I stitched when attaching the pocket pieces made the seam allowance a little wobbly, so I clipped it at those points too, to make it lie more smoothly. Now that understitched seam is sitting nicely just a couple millimeters in from the edge, and you can barely tell the pocket is there from the outside. Here's the finished outside and the lining. I put them right sides together. I lined up all the marks and traced lines on the bib and around the base of the ties, but for the rest I smoothed it out from the lining side. I left an opening about 5 centimeters below one of the ties and made it big enough for my hand so I can turn the apron right side out. I sewed all around the rest of the edge, on the outward side so that I'm on the traced lines for the outside pieces. On the corners and rounded tips I set the stitch length a bit shorter and moved along more slowly with the hand wheel, pivoting when necessary. I noticed that my seams were not quite symmetrical along the sides of the bib decoration, so I sewed a little further in on the side that was too far out. Then I did it 2 more times because it still wasn't right. Now it was time to trim and clip the seam allowances. I trimmed most of the seam allowances down by about half and cut little notches on the outward curves, and diagonal clips in the seam allowances on the inward curves. I also clipped into the lining seam allowance at that inner corner near the bottom. Turning the ties was a bit fiddly. I used a long piece of dowel to poke the whole thing right side out. Most apron ties are just a strip folded in half, which is an easier way to do them, but this is what felt the most compatible with my color blocking. Once the rest of it was turned out, I had to work all the seams to the outside edges, which is one of my least favorite sewing tasks, but I find it's easier when your hands are a little bit damp. I pressed the edges all around the apron. I tried to make sure the lining was a little bit further in from the edge so it won't show. On the side opening, I found it a bit tricky to get the edges straight because it was on the bias and a bit stretchy, and I wished I had stay stitched along those edges. After pressing that edge, I closed it up with a slip stitch using dark brown silk thread. Now it was all assembled and only needed a buttonhole. I laid my pattern piece back on the bib to mark the location. It's got to be long enough to easily fit any of my waistcoat buttons. I know I could have made the stencil design more suited to hiding the buttonhole, but the proportions of berries and leaves wouldn't have looked as nice. I'm using the brown thread that's still in my needle to do a running stitch around the mark, and to overcast it after I cut it open with my thread scissors. I didn't feel like getting the chisel out for just one buttonhole. I had considered putting interfacing in the top of the bib just around the buttonhole, but the test version worked fine without it. It hasn't got a lot of weight to hold up, and it lays smoothly enough with just the 2 layers of fabric. The seam along the outer edge gives it some structure, and the ink also adds a bit of stiffness. For the buttonhole stitches, I'm using brown cotton pearl. For more details on hand-sewn buttonholes, see my buttonhole tutorial video. After that, it was finished. Since my version of the apron is made specifically to wear over waistcoats or jackets, I figured I should also demonstrate making one without a bib. I must note that this is still different from the original sketch because that one has a long strip for the waist ties that encloses the top edge to form a waistband, which is a much more normal way to do it. But the side panels on the original one taper down to nothing right under the waistband, and mine don't because I made the center panel a bit narrower, so I'm doing mine with no waistband in order to not interrupt the color blocking. But of course you could do it the other way if you want to. Just make the bottom part and leave the top unfinished, and once you've turned it right side out and pressed it, you can sew the top edge closed and bind it off with the waist ties. But I did mine like this. I folded down the top of the center pattern piece, first making a crease with a bone folder, and did the same to the lining piece. The new top edge continues from the straight lines at the top of the ties on either side. For this one I made the sides black and the center panel burgundy. Both fabrics are a little heavier than the ones I used for my first two aprons, which is okay because it doesn't have to button to anything. I did gold for the leaves again and tried to get the ink for the berries to match the center panel, but it ended up being a bit more pink because the red ink wasn't opaque enough. And I still had some trouble with the pink ink. It sunk into the fabric so much that I had to wait about 15 minutes and add a second coat. It still came out a bit thin and patchy in some places, so I should have waited longer. I let it dry for more than 24 hours, heat set it just like before, traced out the rest of the pieces, and cut them out. I didn't have enough burgundy fabric for the lining, so I used a mottled golden yellow quilting cotton. I assembled the front and lining exactly the same way as previously demonstrated, excluding the top piece on the non-existent bib, though I did once forget and looked around for the top pieces that weren't there. I marked the opening for turning and did a line of stay stitching on each side, just inside the seam allowance. I used matching thread and it doesn't show up very well on camera, but it's there. Here are both halves, all sewn and pressed. I lined up the top, right sides together, and pinned along that edge, stopping about a third of the way into the ties on either side. Then sewed that portion together. I pressed open only the middle portion of the seam. I'm then pressing all that seam allowance towards the lining side, stopping just a short way into the ties so I don't disturb the ends of the seam. I pressed it from the outside too, to make extra sure it was lying flat. I understitched along the top of the apron, starting and stopping a little way into the ties. This should keep the lining from showing on the outside, without having to do any top stitching. Though of course if you want to do top stitching, it's always an option. I smoothed out and pinned the rest of the apron, but before I did that I also pinned along the top seam so I could make sure it was sitting with the lining edge just a millimeter or two below the top edge of the outer fabric. I didn't get a good shot of this step on the brown one, but I'm smoothing from the lining side so it'll be spread out a little bit tighter than the outer fabric, and that way the lining will be slightly smaller than the outside and hopefully won't stick out around the edges. I sewed the rest of the edges together, leaving that gap in the side. I ran out of yellow thread on the spool, and then on the bobbin, so I had switched to black on both by the end. But it doesn't matter on a seam like this, it won't show. I did all the same trimming and clipping as before, and turned it right sides out. And did all the annoying pressing around the edges. The stay stitching did make it easier to get the edges of the opening pressed in the right place. I sewed up the hole with black cotton thread, and it was finished! I gave the black and burgundy one to my mother, and she was quite excited about the pockets. And if I want one without a bib, I can just fold down the front on one of mine and wear it that way. Before I get to my usual section on how the project went, I just want to add a quick book review because I did read Costume Design and Home Planning, and I'm afraid I did not like it, and I would not want Estelle Peel-Izor as an art teacher. The horrible way she talks about body type and complexion isn't all that surprising for the 1910s, but it still seems worse than average. You can talk about the way colors and shapes affect people's appearance without calling them all ugly and ignorant. She's also weirdly judgmental and mean-spirited about so many other things, like saturated color wheels. Apparently brightly colored pigments are crude and might corrupt the impressionable youths, so they should stop getting students to paint them. And she's against using a lot of bright colors in home decor too. She also seems to really hate evenly spaced stripes and tucks and just even spacing in general, and realistic florals with shading on fabric and lace and wallpaper. It's also just badly written in general and pretty repetitive. If you're going to try to cram costume design and home planning into just 210 pages of large type, minus a bunch of full-page illustrations, you need to be more concise. And the home planning section is not just about decorating. She talks about choosing a lot on which to build the house. For some reason, there's a bunch of stuff on choosing locations to build a shop or other place of business, but then the rest of the book is only about planning a house. So what was the point of all that? There is a page and a half just about different types of soil and what kinds of farming they're suitable for, and then nothing about farming for the entire rest of the book. It's very patchy and disorganized. Why would you not write 2 separate books and make them longer, and give them several more rounds of editing so they don't suck as much? Before I got around to reading it, I checked to see if there were any other works out there by the same author, and the one thing I found was a chapter she contributed to a book called Applied Drawing, also from 1916, which is basically just an abridged version of the costume design portion of the book. But it does have a photograph of one of the other apron designs that's illustrated in the book, which is pretty cool. Speaking of the illustrations, they were done by Catherine Porter Brown and Rachel Taft Dixon. Some of them are signed R. Dixon, and some of them have this little rectangle symbol in the corner, which might be some kind of signature, but the page with the utility aprons has nothing, so sadly I don't know who to credit. Anyways, as much as I love the apron pictures, I do not recommend reading this book. Not to say that it's all bad, there is some good information and some bits I like, but there are definitely better books out there on the same subjects. While I'm off on a tangent, I should mention that I have a Patreon and I post monthly updates with a lot of pictures of the video stuff I'm working on. These videos take a lot of time to make and they usually make very little money, so the Patreon really helps to balance it out. So thank you very, very much to all my patrons for helping me pay my bills. I do have another job, but it's part-time and also pays very badly. As for my aprons, I am very happy with how they turned out. The patterning was easy and the test version went so well that it's almost exactly the same as the second one, just with slightly worse stenciling. The stenciling on the other two was not perfect either. There were a few tiny spots on the burgundy one where it looks like some gold ink stuck to the second stencil and came off, which means I didn't let it dry for long enough. There were also some places on both where the two layers didn't line up very well because the fabric shifted, so if I pulled it taut and held the edges of the fabric down, it would probably be better. When we did screen printing in college, we had to pin the edges of the fabric to the table, but they've got big padded tables in the studio there, and I can't pin into my cutting table, so I would have to try taping the edges down. It was nice to try stenciling on an actual project, and I would like to do more of it. I tend to want to overcomplicate things, so it was a good challenge to have to make the whole design with fairly simple shapes. That one thin strip in between the two longest leaves did wiggle back and forth a little bit, but other than that, it was a very stencil-friendly design. I meant to read some books from the era about stenciling, and I opened them up in tabs, and then I didn't read them, but hopefully I'll get around to that someday. One thing I really want to do more of is combining late 19th to early 20th century decoration styles with 18th century menswear. Besides this, I've also done some Art Nouveau gloves, and many years ago I made an embroidered waistcoat inspired by a Beardsley illustration, but there are so many more things I could make. Art Nouveau swirls would just work so well on the cut of a mid-18th century suit. I like the colors in both my aprons, but the brown was actually not my first choice for this project. I really wanted to do one in light green and off-white with dark green leaves and white berries, but I don't have the right fabric in my stash. And I am trying to be good about not spending too much money on fabric. So far this year I've only bought secondhand fabric, and I'm not going to waste money on new green cotton for an apron when I already have so much cotton. Also, I forgot to mention that all the fabric I used was from my stash, which was good, but sadly I can't say I spent no money because I did get these crappy brushes. But at least crappy brushes are useful for some things. I've already used this one for cleaning my sewing machine, and I used one of the other ones to help glue fabric on my camera bed. These were pretty quick to sew up. The drying time made the stenciling take a couple of days, but the rest of it easily fits into one day. And I think they would look nice with just a print and a solid too. Maybe some photorealistic plants or stripes of even width. Another thing that would be fun is, because the middle part is kind of shaped like a shield, to do some heraldry-inspired color blocking in the middle. That's not really my style, so I'm not going to do that, but it would be fun to make. One downside to this design is it has to be worn over a waistcoat, and right now it's very hot and I have not been wearing them. And even when it's cooler, I'll wear waistcoats when I leave the house, but usually not when I'm at home doing chores. I do want to actually use these, so I'll have to make a conscious effort to put on one of my washable cotton or linen waistcoats so I can wear an apron. I know I could hold up the top with a cord or something through the buttonhole, but if I'm going to do that, I would rather just make another apron for non-waistcoat weather. Number 1 or number 6 would work well with the regular sort of square top most aprons have, but I really do hope I wear these ones. I did wear the test one to make some pasta salad, and a little bit of dressing got on the apron, so that's a start. Mama says she's going to take hers to work and wear it on days when her outfit doesn't have pockets, so that sounds useful. But she also doesn't want to get it dirty, so it might still be a bit of a failure as a utility apron. Late breaking update! They work on my nightgowns! This is very good. I am much more likely to actually use them now. I hope this was interesting, and I hope some more people make historical fantasy aprons. I would love to see pictures of other people's takes on any of these apron designs, so tag me in the social medias if you make one. Okay, thank you for watching. Bye!
Oh, it's so lovely.
Thank you. It has pockets, of course. Did you not notice that?
No!
Oh, I'm sure I mentioned it in one of the posts.
I didn't notice. Yeah. Oh my goodness, those are like real pockets.